Right, so for those of us on time, thank you very much. Hello and welcome. My name is Julian Brockhurst, and thank you for joining us this Thursday lunchtime for another webinar presented by Aprao on today's topic, why construction needs to go digital. I've been looking forward to this conversation for some time, so I'll jump straight in. Firstly, I'd like to introduce our guest for today, Robert, Director of Research and Digital at Construction Skills Queensland. Robert is responsible for driving CSQ's research agenda. He is a leading thinker at the intersection of construction and skills. He writes and talks regularly on all things economic. Robert is also a postgraduate researcher at the University of Queensland with a special interest in regional economic growth. So welcome, Robert.
Thanks for having me.
No worries. So, mate, I'll jump straight in. And you know, you're obviously known to give excellent market overviews at events that you attend. You were just telling me before we started that you've been on a bit of a Queensland tour of late. So I'm not sure if it's possible to do it in under 2 minutes, but what would be your sort of high level overview of where we're at right now?
Yeah, sure. 2 minutes is definitely not enough time to capture the craziness that's kind of going on out there at the moment. But basically, as everyone knows, we're in the middle of a building boom, a house building boom. And that's arrived just so happens at exactly the same time that the supply chain has completely seized up across the industry. A couple of interesting things, I guess, about the boom. One is it's really synchronized. So it's big cities, it's the regions, it's obviously home building, detached housing, but also the commercial sector is going really, really strongly, particularly here in southeast Queensland. But, you know, my interest is really the labour side of it and the sort of supply chain crunch. And we all have heard about the materials shortages, the timber, the steel, the electrical conduit, you name it, we can't get it. But also the labour market has really seized up. Unemployment in the industry, pulled out the data just yesterday, Julian, it's now below 3%. Unemployment in construction across Australia, under 3%. It's an extraordinarily low number. That's well below what economists consider to be full employment. And that's happened at exactly the same time that vacancies have absolutely rocketed. So employers like one in 2. So every second employer at the moment in the construction industry is currently recruiting based on an ANZ survey. And vacancies, so the number of job vacancies in the industry are just like way above normal levels. So you've got this twin problem where there's like really low unemployment, everyone's trying to hire, but there literally aren't enough people there to sort of fill the ranks at the moment. And that's not just because of the demand sort of going sky high. We've had that level of demand before without labour shortages. What's different this time is that we're realising now just how reliant the industry is on migration and on the flow of sort of new warm bodies into the industry. So here in southeast Queensland, turns out about 10% of our workforce is like a new import to the region, either from interstate or from overseas. Obviously, the overseas migrations just stopped completely. But the interstate stuff we think has really slowed down as well, which has basically put a cap on the labour force, even though demand keeps ratcheting up. So simply not enough capacity, 20% over capacity, we reckon. And these pressures are just going to persist for another couple of years, I think.
Wow. I mean, yeah, they are some pretty crazy numbers. And you've ticked off sort of question 2 that I've got for you here in terms of what you think will happen as the property market continues to surge and these building costs continue to rise and the trade resources and workforce reach those maximum levels that you were talking about. Where does that leave us?
Yeah, well, I think we've actually done a little bit of modelling on this, and I think we're probably at sort of peak crunch about now, or at least in the next few months. By the end of sort of next year, things should start to normalise a little bit and some of the pressure will come off. You know, places like India and China, they're, you know, really starting to open up again. So those supplies should start flowing a bit more freely again. So hopefully things will get better from here, not worse from here. But there's no doubt there'll be some casualties. I think a lot of builders, well, maybe not a lot, but certainly, you know, enough for it to be a problem, have signed up to contracts, fixed price contracts, without incorporating these risks and are now pretty exposed when they can't get timber or labour at the prices they think or at the times that they think. So, time is money in construction as well. So the longer a project takes, the more it costs. And it only takes a few projects for a small builder to go to the wall, a few projects that don't go properly for a builder to go to wall. So I think there will be a bit of damage in the industry, and we're watching the insolvency stats pretty closely to see if and when that happens.
Yeah, interesting. So, I guess focusing more directly on CSQ, I'd like to quickly read you a little purpose statement that is outlined in the strategic plan for 2021 to 2025. So it says, our purpose is to provide the Queensland building and construction industry with the information and skills it needs for a strong and sustainable future. So broadly speaking, what are some of the information and skill needs that you see?
Well, I'd sort of break it into two components. I guess there's the immediate skills needs, and then there's the sort of longer term skills needs of the industry and the information that's needed to inform people about, what what the skill demand will be into the future. Now, in terms of the immediate stuff, the simple question of, do we have enough trades to deliver on the demand that's generated by developers and governments, etc., to basically build what needs to be built? Do we tomorrow, do we have enough apprentices coming through? Those kind of questions. And look, frankly, pandemics aside, we actually do that really quite well in our industry. So, you might have seen headlines about crises in apprenticeships and things like that. And that's definitely the case in some occupations like hairdressing, restaurants, things like that. But when it comes to the construction industry and the core trade skills of construction, there are still just as many people putting up their hand to do an apprenticeship as there always has been, and they're completing at relatively normal levels. So in our sort of view of the data, there's plenty of people coming through the pipeline to keep the trade ranks full for that immediate term. So it's really not the burning issue for the industry. The burning issue is really those longer term skills needs. And this is really where it cracks open the opportunity for innovation and digitalisation in our industry. There's like a huge elephant in the room, like a big problem that no one's really talking about in the context of construction. The problem is the ageing population and, what I sometimes call demographic disruption. We hear a lot about it in the context of the health system, the pension system, superannuation, aged care, that sort of stuff. But it's actually got huge implications for the labour force as well. I'll give you another stat. In 1988, I'll just bring it up. The 25% of the workforce in 1988 was aged over 45. This year, that figure is now 40%. So we're approaching half of the workforce is now aged over 45 when it was just a quarter, say, 30 years ago. So to people like us that work in offices, that's, kind of interesting. It's an interesting factoid. But from the perspective of the construction industry, it's actually a mortal threat, because our industry is organised entirely around one very narrow and specific demographic. And that demographic is basically fit young men, right? Like the whole industry runs on there being physically capable, fit men between the ages of, 18 and really 40 before your body starts sort of giving out. And it's been like that for eons, really since the Middle Ages. This is the way our industry's run. And, it's worked for us really quite well. But when we're moving into a world where, the cohort that we rely on, that young male cohort, is going to be shrinking and the older population is going to be a much bigger part of the workforce, well, it really, puts to the sword our industry and effectively our traditional operating model. So the ABS has actually done some forecasts, some population forecasts sort of by age, and they reckon by 2040, 2050, that sort of cohort, that young male cohort, will be about half the size of what it was in the 80s. So we'll have half as many of the traditional workers that we rely on trying to do the same amount of work, because we need to keep building more things as the population expands. But the share of the population that can actually build that stuff in the traditional way is going to be half what it was in the 80s. But of course, we haven't changed the way we operate since the 80s. We haven't changed the way we operate since the 1880s, So essentially, this is a real existential challenge that the industry needs to come to grips with. And it's why the whole technological innovation question, it's not just an academic sort of techie, the tech's there, so we should use it sort of thing. It's actually a necessity because really in this situation, there's only two solutions we've got in front of us. We can either try to convince ever larger proportion of young men to come into the construction industry. Frankly, that's already a pretty tough sell. Trying to get young guys into the construction industry is getting harder and harder every year. So, good luck with that strategy. The second strategy is to find ways to produce the same amount of buildings and infrastructure and things like that with fewer workers. In other words, productivity growth, which is not something the construction industry is particularly well known for. So in my mind, the only real practical answer here is for the industry to innovate.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, right? Like I think the digitization and that innovation of all industries and all sectors is sort of booming at the moment. Tech's having it's been sort of growing and building. If you've got in the equity market, you've seen the sort of the tech companies just skyrocket. And it's because we're sort of getting to that point where, as you say, there's just that innovation wave that's coming through. And I read something the other day where it's like you don't buy a drill, you buy the hole. So what you're looking to do is achieve the outcome. And as you say, when you say about getting warm bodies into the construction industry, is to achieve an outcome. And if that can be achieved in a different way, in a digital way, using technology, then you're still achieving what you set out to do. Which brings me to sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to reinforce that, and I think the builders that are sort of forward-leaning in this space, that's exactly the way they think about it. They think, well, we need this structural steel component sort of over here, or this rebar or whatever. We don't go and hire a steel fixer to put the rebar together. We actually hire the solution, and then there are some really innovative ways to get that solution now, and the guys who are thinking that way are going for it.
Yeah. So in the same document, it also outlines a vision and the priorities for CSQ, including, from a vision perspective, a skilled workforce that meets the evolving needs of Queensland's building and construction industry, and from a priority perspective, building businesses' capability to create the sustainable and resilient industry, supporting industry to evolve and adapt to technological disruptions. So yourself, you're the director of digital. Where do you sort of see some of these, future technology disruptions? How are you preparing your members, and what areas of the industry do you think will be most affected?
Yeah. Well, if you accept my argument, as I do, that this young men thing is the real problem that the industry is going to have to solve. If you accept that argument, I think a couple of solutions really present themselves as the standout technologies that are going to penetrate the industry. The first is, well, I guess not so much a technology as an approach. I kind of think of it as like the gateway drug of construction innovation, and that's prefabrication, or today they call it off-site construction. Now, the beauty of taking construction processes off a construction site and putting them into a factory is that it cracks open the opportunity for all sorts of other innovations and all sorts of other technologies and digitalisation. So on a construction site, it's actually quite difficult to implement new technologies because the site is different with every single job. And in fact, the site changes every day as the building gets built. So it's really hard. It's a really uncontrolled and chaotic environment, which makes it very difficult to penetrate with robotics, automation, things like that. But as soon as you move it into a factory, you get that control, and you can apply all of the, traditional manufacturing techniques that have been developed in the automotive and aviation industries. So that I think is the first big one, and that's being borne out by the trends in the industry. That's where sort of the most innovative stuff is happening. And the second one is what I consider to be the more pure sort of digital plays. So another interesting stat for you. It's been estimated that 30% of time and materials on an average construction project is just waste. So it's just chucked in the bin, 30% of all time and materials. And the main culprit, the main reason why that's the case is basically just information breakdowns in the process of building stuff. So things aren't scheduled properly, or, the schedule changes, but, the right people weren't told. Things were ordered incorrectly. They were communicated incompletely or not communicated at all. Just information breakdowns that just create waste. So this, I think, is really the biggest opportunity, particularly in that on-site construction space. And there's no, you're never going to move to a completely off-site prefabricated construction mode, because ultimately the building needs to be placed in its final resting place. So there will always be construction happening on site. And it's here that I think digital can really shine to solve this information problem. Controlling that sort of the flow of information, making sure that everyone who needs to know what they need to know, they get the information where they need it, when they need it. And this all has to happen, obviously, in the really chaotic and changing environment of a construction process. And this is where I think digital really comes into its own. So I'm really excited about some companies coming out of Australia that are doing things with, say, the Internet of Things, where you put little sensors on plant materials, people, equipment, and those sensors just generate an ocean of data. And that data you can then mine, you can use it and leverage it to optimize the process of construction, basically in the same way they do in manufacturing facilities. And then there's sort of digital marketplaces as well that are taking the friction out of a lot of the normal construction processes, much like you guys are taking the friction out of some parts of the development process. There's one company out of Southeast Queensland here called the Skill Exchange, which provides a marketplace for builders to access subcontractors that they don't normally work with, which is actually a real problem in our industry, because, if you're a builder, you kind of have a narrow group of subbies that you're constantly working with, because, you got their number and they're a known quantity and everything. But if you need to, at times like these, where you need to sort of broaden your reach because all the subbies are really, really busy, there's no real easy way to do that. So digital solutions, web-based digital solutions to make those connections, I think are really exciting.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's an important point. As we focus on the construction industry, I think a lot of people get caught up on robots laying bricks as a very oversimplified example, where the digitization and the technology that can have a huge impact really sits on, as you say, the information side, on that sort of, I guess, business side of the construction industry. And there's a lot of efficiency and a lot of gain that can happen there before we get to the point, if we ever get to the point of, robots and drones laying bricks and putting buildings in place, which, we can debate about another day, I'm sure, in sort of a decade's time. But it is about that communication, I think, big time. And so, us here at Aprao, we put together recently, admittedly, and as it said on the graph, an incomplete list of prop techs and property solutions within Australia. It was aimed at the development industry. So there was sort of like site finding. Then there was massing tools and digitization of those massing tools, procurement sites and marketplaces. And it was just putting in a few of the ones you hear about on a daily or weekly basis, if you're in this space, of companies, that have industry leaders, that have those people that have been in the industry. So PropTech Brisbane recently, here's a stat going the other way. PropTech Brisbane released a report recently whereby, from a PropTech perspective, the founders of PropTechs, everyone thinks of founders of startups as, early 20-year-olds in Silicon Valley. In the PropTech industry, or at least here in Australia, we're seeing that at least one of the founders, so probably the person that has the idea before they get the technical software developer, has had at least 10 years within the property industry, right, within their sort of vertical. So these are highly professional people that have identified an issue, couldn't solve it within the company or space they're in, and decided to start up their own business. So they understand it, and they're out there with some really good, solutions. And it's just about then getting everyone else to buy into it. So having said that, I know you're not super familiar with Aprao, but one of the things we're trying to do is, again, solve that information breakdown, have everyone working off the same piece of information from a development finance and feasibility standpoint. On that side of things, as people prep developments and prep the construction and then work through with their contractors, is there anything else that you probably think that someone like Aprao could do to help?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. And actually, just to step back from that, you're your comment before about these solutions coming from within the industry, I think is really, really pertinent. And we get a lot of people sort of coming through our doors in the sort of skills kind of space who've maybe been outside the industry, well, often outside the industry, outside the training sector, outside the construction industry, but have got a kernel of a great idea, and they think they've got a startup. But once you get in here, it's really, and I don't think this is just unique to construction. There's a lot of ins and outs, and I think real solutions that really add value, they come from within people who know the industry intimately and can solve a burning problem. And that's certainly been our experience as well in the sort of skilling and training space. To your question about sort of Aprao, as I understand it, you're sort of, the tip of the spear in a way, that very first part of the vertical, I guess, the built environment vertical, if you like, that development, feasibility, etc. So it's kind of construction adjacent, we might say. But what I think is really powerful that companies like yours and other people in this space in the development industry can do is start setting up the incentives and the expectations for builders and contractors, so the construction operators themselves. Now, a lot of what a builder does is just respond to what their clients demand, right? So either their clients are government, or if it's a private developer or whatever, they will do the minimum necessary to win the job, right? So if the tender from the government doesn't require them to have a target for local content, or doesn't require them to have an environmental this or a whatever, safety that, they won't do it. But you put that stuff in and all of a sudden they're paying attention. And I think the same sort of principle applies here to the digital sort of literacy. I don't think they'll come to it naturally just because it's a good idea. I think it comes when the developers, whether they're private or public, start sort of raising the level of expectation and pushing it further down into the permafrost, that this digital stuff actually needs to be part of your business if you want to do business with us. And so I think to the extent that Aprao and other platforms are kind of digitising that space where there's probably more of an appetite, a natural appetite for it, perhaps, I think it kind of helps to just produce this groundswell of expectation that things need to change and sort of catalyse change in the industry.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you say, it really is. I mean, other than sort of maybe identifying sites, then you're running your feasibility on it, and it really does flow down from there. And so setting yourself up at the start is kind of what Aprao is really, really focused on, right? In terms of getting that data and making those critical assumptions, making sure that they're very, very, I guess, industry backed or data backed, so that when you get to the end of the project and as built does equal what you envisaged 2-3 years prior in most cases. So CSQ is known for leading innovative industry research. Are there any exciting projects that you're working on them at the moment that you can sort of tell us about, maybe?
Yeah, sure. We've got we're always sort of doing little bits and pieces with some of the more, I guess, forward-leaning builders and universities and things like that. But we've got two sort of major projects on at the moment. One relates to virtual reality and the use of virtual reality, and the other relates to hydrogen and the rise of the hydrogen economy. So the VR stuff is actually, it's not necessarily about the construction process per se. It's about skilling and training. So we're running a study in conjunction with QUT here in Brisbane and well, they're not really a startup anymore. They're a proper VR company that was a startup just a few years ago, but now have quite grown considerably in the VR learning space, so using virtual reality as a training aid. And so we're answering a very specific question, and that's basically, does virtual reality move the dial? So if I take a high-risk training course like working at heights or confined spaces or something like that, really common in the industry, it's actually a very expensive piece of training to deliver because you've got to have the plant, the equipment, the big warehouse, etc. But everyone needs to do it. You need it to be legal. So the question is, if we convert that sort of face-to-face analog kind of training experience to a virtual reality experience, can we get the same outcomes? Obviously, it's not acceptable if the outcome's not as good, but if it's as good, some people suggest it may even be better. But basically, that's the question we're answering with this study. So for us, it's really interesting. Has never been done before in Australia. As far as we know, it's never been done before in the construction industry, about whether this virtual reality technology can actually cut the mustard in the way that the marketing materials suggests it can. So that's sort of number one. Number two is hydrogen. So, if you sort of follow government infrastructure announcements and things like that, you probably notice a fair bit of hype around this idea of a hydrogen economy in Australia as sort of an export economy. And there's suggestions that Queensland's going to be an outsized kind of player in that. So we're really interested in, what does that look like for a construction industry and for the built environment? Are we talking about, an NBN system for the gas pipeline where you've got to tear up all the old gas pipeline and put new pipeline in that can accommodate hydrogen? Are we going to be replacing all our ovens and things with hydrogen ovens? Or is it going to be something that's a lot more niche and industrial and export oriented? And then ultimately, what are the implications for the construction industry and the construction workforce in that space in terms of number of jobs, where the jobs are likely to be, and the skills that the industry might need to sort of make all this happen? So they're kind of the big ones that we're working on at the moment.
Amazing. Yeah, I think just from the VR perspective, I once went to a bit of a demo on VR, and it was walking out on a 10-story building on a little post. And I tell you what, like, as someone that's not the best with heights, it made the feeling real. You knew you were in a room, you knew you were walking on a line or a piece of tape, but putting the VR headset on, it makes it very real. So hopefully that training comes to fruition and gets the results you guys are looking for.
Absolutely.
So as a movie,
it is actually incredible.
Yeah,
sorry, mate. I was just going to say, it is actually incredible how immersive the experience is. I was personally very surprised when I first did it as well at just how real it was. But the most interesting thing about the VR more broadly, taken out of the training context, is when you link it up with other digital assets and other digital, sources of information. That's really where you start to see the power of it come through in terms of reducing delays and streamlining processes and things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. So as we move into sort of the final few questions, I'd invite the audience attending to throw some questions in the chat if you do have any, and I'll try and get to them by the end. But why do you think, Robert, that innovation or that consistent search for improvement is so essential for everyone, no matter the business size or industry?
Yeah, okay. Without wanting to get too philosophical on you, it's effectively the reason we have capitalism as we know it and all the magnificent things that we live with in our world in 2021 is only possible because of innovation. Like, the whole reason why we keep increasing our living standards is because we keep increasing our productivity, meaning we just produce more with less every year. The reason why we produce more with less is mainly because we technologically innovate. So really, if we want our living standards to keep rising, you just have to keep innovating. For me, it's, people often ask this question, why do we need to innovate? People in my industry, we've been just fine for the last 300 years doing it this way, and it is true. We have been. But ultimately, there's going to be, a day of reckoning, at least around this demographic disruption. An economy that doesn't innovate, that doesn't get productivity gains, is a stagnant economy, and living standards will fall.
Yeah, couldn't agree with you more. There's going to be some sort of catalyst, but as you say, the construction and the property industry at large has been quite a laggard in terms of its adoption of digitization, its adoption of technology. And you don't have to look too far to find examples of people that didn't want to change in other industries and got consumed by the wave of innovation, or those that looked up, engaged with it, and rode the wave and stayed ahead of it. Okay, so all quiet on the front of our guests here. So what I guess is the best way for today's audience to get in touch with you if they want to sort of find out more or follow some of your talks?
Oh, yeah. Well, most of what we do, we publish on LinkedIn. So if you follow me on LinkedIn, connect with me on LinkedIn, you can you can see all of our latest output. But if you've got something specific you want to talk about, I'm always happy to talk to anyone about anything. So just flick me an email, robert.sobyra@csq.org.au.
Amazing. All right. Well, I guess that's time for today. So thank you everyone for your time, especially to Robert. As we bring more leaders together from the development ecosystem, please reach out if you think there's someone else we should have a chat to, or another topic you want us to cover. But until next time, take care. Thank you very much.